My name is Jack Petranker. I'm the director of the Mangalam Research Center, and I guess you could say co-director of Mangalam Center, which is the organization that's sponsoring this talk. So we have been here in downtown Berkeley since 2010, and we focus on research related to Buddhism, but also on a number of other topics. And Mangalam Center is a kind of umbrella for presentations that we make for the public at large. And we have a growing program of activities. I'll just mention the next one that's coming up. It's on a very different kind of topic. It'll be a presentation by Tomer Persico, who is a visiting professor at the University of California from the University of Tel Aviv. And he's going to be talking about the Jewish tradition of meditation and Jewish mysticism. So that'll be in February. And if you're on our list, you'll find out about it. If you're not, you should be. So make sure you correct that before you leave. I think that's about all I want to say about what we do in general. We're very happy to have you here tonight, and we're especially happy, of course, to have David Presti with us. David is a friend who's participated in events here and at our sister institution down the street here, Dharma College. His interests, I would say, coincide very nicely with ours. But of course, his day job is as a professor at the University of California here in Berkeley. He's a neurobiologist and psychologist and cognitive scientist. He holds 2 PhDs. One is in clinical psychology, and the other one is, what shall we say, molecular biology and biophysics. I'm just reading off your page here, David, so that guarantees that I won't get anything wrong, I hope. He also has engaged in a very interesting project for a number of years now, teaching science to Tibetan monks and nuns. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to get into that at some point, although that's not the main focus of our being here tonight. We're here tonight in celebration of the publication of David's book, which has been out for about 2-3 months now, something like that, published by Columbia University Press, Mind Beyond Brain. Subtitle is Buddhism, Science, and the Paranormal. And we do have a few copies. David graciously brought some copies in his possession, and we can actually sell them. But there will be, we don't have nowhere near enough for people here. But if you're interested, David has agreed to sign a copy if you would like that. And that can happen afterwards, after the presentation tonight. Also, I should mention that afterwards there will be refreshments downstairs, light refreshments. But it'll be a chance for people to get together and discuss what we've talked about, or just enjoy yourselves for a bit. I think that's really all we need to say for right now. So I'm going to turn it over to David, and the plan for the evening is that David will talk for however long he wants to talk for, and then we'll engage in a conversation, and then when it seems appropriate, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. There are a couple of microphones in the audience, and we will have volunteers. Is that right? I'm looking around for our volunteers. To take the microphones around for people. And we'd ask you to use the microphones because we are recording this. We will be posting the video of this event in the not too distant future. I make no promises about the exact date, but I'm expecting it'll be something that a lot of people will be interested in, so we're grateful that we have the opportunity to do that as well. So, David?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jack. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to be here at this wonderful, auspicious location. And just thank you for the invitation to talk about this work in this forum. And thanks to you all for coming. This is really stunning and encouraging, I think, for broadening this conversation. So I'll try not to talk too long because there's a lot to say, and be careful about just asking me to talk as long as I want, you know. but to open this up for a larger discussion would be, I think, of benefit pretty quickly. So where to start? So, I mean, excuse me, as Jack said, my background is in biophysical science, basically, and I've been teaching at UC Berkeley in the molecular and cell biology department for 28 years now, and I teach courses on general introduction to neuroscience and also upper division neurochemistry kinds of things, and then seminars on consciousness and mind and matter and so forth. My deep interest really has been, since I was in college, you know, kind of the nature of mind and reality, and how it was that we could figure out things that we figure out about how the universe works. And so that's what kind of got me into all of this stuff, and then I've been pursuing it in these various ways. And as part of that, to frame where this project is coming from, as part of these questions of like, what is reality? And normally that's tackled by contemporary science in disciplines like physics, you know, quantum physics, relativity, cosmology, and astrophysics, and so forth. Those are the fields that claim to be getting at the the deep nature of how the universe is structured and how it operates. And when it comes to the nature of mind and consciousness, then that would be thought of as something that would be in some way related to biology, because we're biological creatures, and also psychology, cognitive science, those disciplines. And when it comes to the sort of most profound questions in either of those categories, like what is reality, as we kind of dig deeper and deeper and deeper, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier. We don't really know what's going on at the kind of deepest levels of matter and energy. And there's a lot of disagreement on how to interpret what we do measure. And in the area of what is mind, which is essentially asking, like, who are we as conscious beings in this physical universe? How are we related to that? And a similar way, we really have not a lot to say about that when we get to the final kind of what we can say. And what we can say, the standard way of framing that is, okay, the universe is made of physical matter. Physical matter has been around for billions of years. It was created in the Big Bang in some way. I mean, physicists have worked out very detailed scenarios about how it was created. It continues to be created in stars in terms of like heavier elements created from or made from lighter ones. And so there's an ongoing creation of matter, and matter and energy interact in ways that we can describe with mathematical physics to kind of give us some understanding of physical reality. After billions of years of time, stars evolve, planetary systems evolve, life evolves on certain forms in some mysterious way, yet to be described in detail, but most scientists think that eventually we'll be able to capture a kind of physical picture of how living organisms came about. So this happened after a few billion years, and then after a few billion more years, we have developed sophisticated nervous systems and sensory apparatus and so forth, and then at some point, very recently, relatively speaking, consciousness kind of pops out of all of that. That somehow the biological system becomes sufficiently sophisticated that we become self-aware and able to have a sense of space and time and our position in it and so forth. So that's sort of the standard model of how folks think it operates. When it comes to actually understanding what the physical basis of things like conscious awareness are, it's still a deep mystery. But many neuroscientists and psychologist types will firmly believe that eventually, if we just keep doing what we're doing to learn more about the structure and function of living organisms and nervous systems and brains, that we'll eventually figure it out. Now, if you step back a bit, there's a kind of irreducible entanglement or enfolding of mind and reality that has been ignored for 500 years of development of Western science. And that, I say Western science because it developed out of Europe and then into America, but really it's become globalized now that we do science in the same way all over the world. Everything we know is by means of our conscious awareness, and through our thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions of the world around us. Everything is coming through our mind, and so all that we know about the world comes via our mind, and then we develop this model of the world that kind of has mind appearing at some rather late stage of the game. But all of that has come from the perceptions of our mind to begin with. And so there's this kind of irreducible enfolding between mind and world that we have ignored in our scientific method by simply assuming that there is some kind of objective world out there that we can describe, and we describe it pretty well. It works really well. Again, our science has given us laptops and airplanes and smartphones and all kinds of fancy gizmos and gadgets. It's hard to argue that it's not working. So it works really well, but it may hit the wall when it comes to actually understanding what mind is in the context of all that, because it's kind of been removed from the picture from the beginning, just assuming there's a world out there. So the question is it useful to readdress this when it comes to developing an expanding science of consciousness? Might something be gained from taking seriously this enfolding of mind and reality from the beginning? So the Dalai Lama has been interested in science for his entire life. And about 35 years ago, he had the idea that perhaps a more formalized dialogue between his tradition of Tibetan Buddhism and representatives of the world of science in some kind of conversation around how those two traditions of science versus Tibetan Buddhism, in his case, kind of view an investigation of mind and reality. So science is interested in those things. What is the world? What is the mind? And Tibetan Buddhism is very much interested in those things, like what is the nature of mind? How is it related to what we think reality is? How can a deeper understanding of mind and world inform human behavior in hopefully a direction of greater compassion and sort of positive benefit to reducing suffering and so forth. And so he thought these are two complementary ways of kind of viewing the interaction of mind and world, and maybe something useful could come from a mutual exploration of that as a conversation. So this really got traction. About 31 years ago now, there was the first kind of formalized meeting between the Dalai Lama and some representatives of the scientific tradition. mostly in that first meeting, they were neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. And it has continued since then, and there have been many groups of scientists which have dialogued with the Dalai Lama. And then at some point, around 18 years ago, 2000, he put the idea out there that, look, I can't be the only guy that's involved in these conversations. There should be more people who are expert in Buddhist philosophy and practice that know enough science that they can also engage in the conversation. And so in order for that to happen, there needs to be science education in the Buddhist monasteries. Because if you go to the monastery now to become a monk or a nun, you don't get any science education. So some folks go to the monasteries or nunneries when they're a little older, like maybe they've already had elementary school and some high school, so they've already learned some science. But many people come when they're 6 years old or 8 years old, and they're not going to know anything. So he said, we need to have science education in the monastic institutions. And the leaders of the monastic institutions in India said, what do you mean by that? We don't have time for that. This is like, we got enough to do already. It's not really that important. But he persisted, and his view was strategic. I mean, it was not only training monastics in science in order to engage in this conversation, but it was also bringing the traditions of his culture more into the 21st century, giving them more traction, allowing them to kind of better find their place in the modern world. But because of his capacity to influence people in the Tibetan monastic system in India, this eventually caught on. And the first program to actually seed science educational stuff in the monastic institutions in India began in 2000. It was called Science for Monks for many years because it was only working in monasteries. Now it's called Science for Monks and Nuns, and programs are done both in monasteries and nunneries. And I was fortunate enough to cross paths with that organization in 2004. And have been doing neuroscience education in monasteries and nunneries in India, and more recently in Bhutan and Nepal. We did the first program in Bhutan 2 years ago, and the first program at a nunnery in Nepal this past summer. And a few years after our group started, a much larger project came out of Emory University in Georgia, which has been spreading science education among thousands of monks. So there are now thousands of monks and nuns in India and other Himalayan countries that are getting pretty sophisticated exposure to notions of biophysical science. And so this is going to change the whole tenor of the conversation, I believe, in the decades to come. So the final piece I'll say as background about this particular book is there are a number of things that happen, not only in Buddhism, but everywhere in the world, that are not explicable by contemporary science. And that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, why should it surprise anyone at any point that what we have right now in our particular physical, biological description of so-called reality is somehow the final answer? But for some reason, people often think that way at any moment, not only now, but 150 years ago. People thought that way in physics. There were people certainly by the turn of the 20th century, moving from the 19th to the 20th century, there were a number of prominent physicists who said, physics is done. We got it down. We got it figured out. It's only going to be a matter of kind of doing more and more refined experiments and pinning things down to the next decimal place and so forth. But all the big ideas they're done. And then along comes Einstein and special relativity and general relativity, and then quantum physics, and it changed everything. Huge paradigm shifts in the way that people thought about the nature of reality, but we're now kind of back at this place again where many people are kind of saying the same thing, not so much about physics, because there's actually some real mysteries there, like dark matter and dark energy, and whether the string theory has any viability to it and all these kinds of things. But more in the area of biology and psychology, I kind of hear it a lot, that it's kind of, we've got it figured out. We know life is complex. We know if we look closer and closer to what's going on microscopically in cells and so forth, that it becomes more complicated, but it's probably not going to be a big surprise of any kind. Everything will sort of fit into the same paradigm that we have right now. And I personally don't believe that. I don't think there's any reason to believe that. I think that we're actually poised for a huge revolution in cognitive science, broadly defined. That is, trying to understand what we are as conscious beings and how we fit into the rest of reality. And not that whatever this next big revolution is going to be the final answer, but it'll be one step along some kind of path. So, and I consider myself to be an empiricist, so I don't have a theory of how this is going to happen, except that it will somehow respect this enfolding or entanglement of mind and world, but I pay attention to the data. And so there are a number of phenomena around that are described in this book by colleagues of mine at the University of Virginia who have been studying these things for more than a half a century. Things like small children sometimes who are 2, 3, 4 years of age, just when they first start talking, will sometimes start talking in great detail about somebody else's life. And if that happens in a culture where there's a belief in reincarnation, then that's taken seriously, and it's taken as evidence in support of this phenomena of reincarnation. If it happens in the United States, parents don't know what to make of it. They're probably trying to distract their son or daughter by something else and stop talking about this, obsession with their imaginary whatever. But in a few cases, this has been studied by colleagues of mine at the University of Virginia and seemingly verified in extraordinary detail about somebody knowing something that they shouldn't be able to know about somebody's life, maybe who died a few years ago or a few decades ago. Now, that hardly proves reincarnation to me, but it suggests that there's some weirdness going on there around information transfer between beings in the world that we don't have a clue, about how to capture in our contemporary science. Or people that have a cardiac arrest, they're revived. Most of the time when that happens, most of the time when it happens, 75% of the time when it happens, they don't remember anything. But nearly a quarter of the time when it happens, they remember stuff, and they remember not only just vague stuff, but extraordinary detail of mental activity, their life passing before them, and sometimes out-of-body experiences where they describe in great detail looking down on the scene of something in an operating room or something at an accident or something like this in ways that they would not be able to do by any normal means. Now, the standard explanation of that is they fabricated it. I mean, not out of fraud, but just simply because they just made it up in some misunderstood way. Somebody described the scene to them, and then they made up a story as if they had actually seen it themselves, just kind of inadvertently and so forth. So my point is that there are lots of phenomena that are part of human experience that we don't understand. One more example, and then I'll kind of bring it to a close, is people who have loved ones or other people extremely close to them in some way that are either die or in a serious traumatic circumstance at some distant place away, hundreds or thousands of miles. And then they have an apparition, or they have a feeling, a very powerful feeling that something has happened to this person dear to them. And then they find out at some point later that, as far as they can tell, pretty much exactly at that time period, this person was seriously injured or killed or something like that. And again, the standard explanation of that is coincidence, but maybe not, because there are lots and lots of stories like that make it unlikely that they're all just coincidences. So the point is here, as an empirical scientist, to take some of these things a little bit more seriously and investigate them. Now, what's the connection with Buddhism? A lot of folks from the Asian Buddhist traditions take these things very seriously. In fact, have whole, frameworks of reincarnation, which are in part based on what they feel are empirical data in support of those things. And so a number of times the Dalai Lama, for example, has brought up these things in conversation with scientists. And the scientists all say, that's impossible. They say things like, that's impossible. We can't do scientific investigation of such phenomena. That's a belief. That's not a scientifically verifiable idea, and so forth. So the conversations have gone nowhere. So I feel like this is a real missed opportunity, because here we have many very intelligent and experienced people who are very engaged in wanting to further explore these topics, but there's no connection to being able to do this across the conversation table between the scientists and the Buddhists. And so the main reason for producing this book was to put the ideas out onto the landscape of conversation, hoping that there would be some traction, that more folks would then be inspired to take it up. And in particular, I wrote it in such a way that a scientifically educated but still skeptical person might still be willing to actually take a look at it and read it, because it's all framed in this context of the history and philosophy of science in a way that, at least to me, feels very reasonable, like this is something that is worth investigating. So that's my hope, that it will simply expand the dialogue in some way to lead to further innovative discoveries and ideas, yet to be determined, something like that. Is that an okay start?
Sure. Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's so many things to talk about there. I'm going to start with a question that I actually had thought I'd ask toward the end, but you focused a lot on the work that you do in Tibetan monasteries and nunneries. Do you bring this up with the Tibetan monks and nuns, these kinds of questions, and how do they react?
Yeah, I mean, the main goal of my work with the Tibetans so far has been really to deliver concise, packaged science education. So the goal is to really get them up to speed in some of the basic foundational issues in contemporary neuroscience, from my perspective. So that takes some intentional focus. However, I do, certainly as part of side conversations and so forth, ask about these things, and they're all interested. And I also try to make it clear that it really is inappropriate to say that these kinds of things are not legitimately investigatable in a scientific context, because they are. And so I don't want the folks that I'm teaching there to come away with the idea that there's kind of one right path forward, and these are the acceptable facts and these are not acceptable facts, and so forth. When I was in South India last summer, so as a result of all of this effort, the large Gelugpa Tibetan monasteries, Gelugpa is one of the major streams of different kind of streams of Tibetan Buddhism. This is more representative of Nyingma, right? I have that right, yes. So here, but they all have basically the same kinds of all the basic tenets of Buddhism are the same in all of them, and they're just elaborated a little differently in these different streams. So in the Gelugpas, which is the Dalai Lama's own tradition, all the major monasteries in India now have science centers, which are run by the monks and nuns themselves. So we spent a week at the science center at the largest of the Tibetan Gelugpa monasteries in South India. It's called Sarah J, has thousands of monks. And they have a very vigorous science center there. And so one afternoon, we just got all the the monks that were involved in this particular science center together, and we kind of brainstormed and had them write all over the board various topics that they thought would be important to investigate. And all of these things came up, spontaneously on their part as things that would be worthy of a good scientific investigation. So there's a lot of interest from their side, which is encouraging.
You were giving me an example over dinner of I asked the question, well, are they doing their own research? Have they initiated their own research projects? And you mentioned one project that's going on right now about debate, which I thought was fascinating. Maybe you could say something about that.
So again, the goal is to simply provide some basic education, seed ideas, and then let it go. And already the monastics that have been studying science for more than 10 years, some of them now are now engaged in translation projects where they're translating texts, like college texts in physics and biology and mathematics into Tibetan for use in their own teaching there. And one of the other parts of that of that collaboration is to generate enthusiasm for doing scientific research. And so my colleague Bryce Johnson, who runs the Science for Monks and Nuns program from the Western side, has started a project where he has collaborated with a group of international neuroscientists who do electrical recording from the brain, EEG, electroencephalography. And they've developed a system that corrects for artifacts of movement. So they wire up these monks with these brainwave recording devices and then have the monks engage in this practice, which is really unique to Tibetan Buddhism as far as I know, but I really don't know very much about this, a kind of meditative debate where if anyone ever seen videos of Tibetan monks or nuns debating with one another? Yeah, it looks like they're like fighting. They yell at one another. One of the monastics sits on the ground. The other one hovers over him or her, because the nuns do this too. We were at a nunnery in Nepal in the summer doing a week-long science of perception thing there, and all the hundreds of Tibetan nuns doing this process of debate where they kind of, so one is sitting on the ground, the other one's up here, and then there's a Q&A, and when they want to make a point, they like that while yelling, at the same time they're yelling and swinging their malas around. And so but it's a meditation. It's actually a meditation when they're doing this, and they do it for hours sometimes. And so they've got them wired up with EEGs now, and they're doing recordings while they're doing that, and they're looking for synchronization of certain aspects of brain activity and so forth. So it's really an interesting project. And there are monastics that are full co-authors of this whole project, and that they're an important part of the whole development of the protocol and when it would be important to actually look at the kinds of measurements that they want to look at and so forth. So we're hoping that this is, and I'm not involved in that project at all, I just know about it, but we hope that this will be just one of a whole stream of different kinds of collaborative research and innovative research of their own that they'll develop in the monasteries in the years to come.
Okay, great. So just to be clear, nothing about the Science for Monks and Nuns project is in the book. Well, maybe it's mentioned briefly somewhere.
Mentioned in a note, that's it.
Okay, okay. If you have questions about it later on, feel free to ask. But I'm going to turn now more to some of the material that is in the book. So the basic question, I think I want to start actually with a quote I came across the other day by Galileo. So right back at the beginning of the Western scientific tradition in some ways. And he says, philosophy is written, and by philosophy he really means natural philosophy or science. So let's just say science. Science is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. But the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. So that's a very strong statement of a kind of core principle, it seems to me, of a lot of what science does and how it's understood. Speaking completely as an outsider, I know very little about science. But anyway, if that's your take, how do you investigate these other kinds of questions and concerns where you really can't do that kind of analysis? You can't measure. You can't do well, a little bit they've tried statistical analysis. Maybe we can talk about that. But anyway.
That's a great quote. Galileo was a great guy. I think that only captures a part of reality and also how we can approach reality. It captures a part of reality that Galileo was very facile with. I mean, he was one of the founders of modern physics, and the language of contemporary physics is certainly mathematics. But that one way of understanding, and that also operates on this assumption of this objective world out there. That one way of kind of gathering information and then observations and then modeling it with something that looks like mathematics, powerful as it is, I don't see any reason why that would capture all of the deep mystery of reality. And there was I don't have any equally lucid quotes to bring up right now, but there was this philosopher of science at Berkeley for many years. He was at many different places, but he spent a number of years at Berkeley, Paul Feyerabend, who wrote a book called Against Method. And the whole book was about beware of being limited by having a methodology which is too narrow to really capture the complexities of the deep mystery of whatever real is. So I think we have to be open to using the kinds of methodologies that will move us forward, and not think that only one is the one right way. So if you look at a tradition like the contemplative traditions of Asia, like Buddhism or Hinduism before it and so forth, that have spent several thousand years trying to get a grasp of reality by going deeply within and developing practices that allowed them to discover things about who we are as we move through the world. There's no mathematics involved, in that there's a very rich understanding of some component of reality. Yeah. This quote is so well known now that I almost don't want to use it, but it just seems so relevant. It was Maslow who said when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it does seem like science has its hammer, right? But maybe there are other tools, other possibilities available. Okay, well, let me give you one other quote, and this is one that you use in your part of the book, and maybe I should say something about how the book is set up.
it's a relatively short book, and it's got 5 chapters, and the opening...
6.
6? Oh, there's an introduction, right? Does that count?
6 plus the prologue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, then I'm missing something. I don't remember what it is. But in any event, the beginning chapter, the opening chapter, is by David, and the closing chapter is, so he kind of frames the discussion. And then there are chapters by scholars who are really focused on one of these areas, like near-death experiences and the paranormal, psychic phenomena, things like that. But in one of the sections that you wrote, you quote Douglas Hofstadter, and I thought it was an interesting quote. I went back and looked at the whole thing, so I'm going to give you what he says. So he says, just as a hypothetical, he says, suppose that someone submitted an article to a journal, and maybe I should say that he wrote this in the context of a debate that was held, because someone did submit an article to a very esteemed journal about precognition, right? And they published it, and that made a lot of scientists mad. Just the fact that they published it. And people said, well, what's wrong with publishing it? Right? And so Hofstadter and several other people commented on this. But Hofstadter says, suppose you had an article that someone submitted which contained evidence that the number 13 really was unlucky. Right? And he said, the evidence looks very good. They had very solid data to suggest that it was unlucky. I don't think he goes any further into it, but what I was imagining was maybe he showed that people who were born on the 13th day of whatever month had a shorter life expectancy or something like that. And it was very solid data. Said, well, so should you publish that? And he says, no, you shouldn't publish it. Because what he says is, and so I'm going to quote him, he says, such an article would not only be about the luckiness or unluckiness of the number 13, but it would also necessarily, if only implicitly, be about the entire nature of the universe we live in. Since if 13 really were provably unlucky in any sense at all, then all bets would be off about the laws of physics. For the laws of physics are simply not compatible with such a finding. Okay, I think I have your reaction, but maybe you'd like to say a little bit about that.
Oh, okay. I mean, I didn't actually use that particular quote.
You didn't, right?
Yeah, but okay. So just to provide the context for this again. In 2011, there was an article published in the Journal of Social and Personality Psychology, which is a very prestigious journal in that field, by Daryl Bem, who's a experimental social psychologist at Cornell and a very well-respected elder in his field. He had for many years been the editor of that journal and so forth. And so and for many years, so he's done lots and lots of very conventional experiments, but for decades, he's also been interested in these so-called anomalous phenomena, or you can call it paranormal. Let me just put a little tangent in there about that word, because I don't use that word that much in the book, and that wasn't my idea to put it in the title. But I went along with the idea. I mean, I chose the title Mind Beyond Brain. I liked that. And then I had a more dry subtitle, Deepening the Dialogue Between Buddhism and Science or something like that. And the Columbia University Press people said, yeah, that's kind of boring, How about Buddhism, Science, and the Paranormal or something like that? And I oh my God, I don't want to say that word. That's almost as bad as saying UFO or something, But then I consulted with my colleagues who are co-authors, and then other colleagues of mine who who work in this realm, who are mostly in religious studies and so forth, and really, came to the conclusion that, I mean, when this word was introduced into the English lexicon in the early 20th century, it was meant to be a legitimate academic category to describe phenomena that weren't currently capturable or understandable by the kind of physical science theory that we had at the time. That's all it meant. Of course, since then, it's been saddled with all kinds of woo-woo crazy associations as a result of those stupid movies and stuff like that. So that's why it made me a little nervous. But I went ahead and said, okay, I'll be part of the program to rehabilitate it, and we'll put it in there. But basically, what I mean is, anomalous things that really we can't explain. The so-called laws of physics, as we have articulated them right now in the language of mathematics, don't capture it. But they don't disprove it either, and by any way whatsoever. So if you just take that number 13 thing, I mean, what if it were really empirically demonstrable by oodles of empirical research that were accurate, that 13 really was an unlucky number? It doesn't contradict any laws of physics. It just means that our physics is not capturing something which is going on in the realm of human interaction with reality in some way. So the Hofstadter quote, and I don't even use his name in the book. You have to go to the footnote to find it. I'm not picking on him because I like his books, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, and all that. So this guy, Daryl Bem, has been interested in these anomalous phenomena, and so for years he had been doing these studies of what is described by this word precognition. That is, that you can know something before you actually get the sensory information that it's happened. And so he was doing very standard social psychology kinds of experiments, and then reversing the time sequence of when the subject had to make the response as to what they wanted to respond, say this side or that side of a screen or something like that, before they actually got the information of what was on the screen to respond to. And he found, very significant, statistically significant, in the same way that are the standards for all papers that are published in these fields. He found statistically significant effects across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trials of 8 or 10 different kinds of experiments over data that he collected over a number of years. So he sends it to the journal, and the editors of the journal say, we can't publish this. I mean, there's no, it's like nobody will believe it. It did. And then somebody else said, well, we have to, it's like Daryl Bem, he was the editor, we can't just ignore it. So they found the most critical reviewers they could find. They sent the paper out for review. It passed all the bars. Maybe he had to make some tweaks like reviewed papers often have to do. And passed all the bars, and then they published it. Even before the paper was published, even before it came out, the New York Times got wind of it, and they had a front page article about how something was titled something like ESP research is generating, lots of debate or something like that. And then they had gone out and interviewed some various people to comment on it. And the people that I'm sure they interviewed hadn't even seen the paper, let alone read it. And so then you got these quotes like the one I do use saying, if this were true, it would bring down the entire foundations of everything we know about science, or something like that. That's the one I used. I said, oh my God, just roll your eyes. It's like, come on, what kind of science is that? It's like you look at the empirical data and then you try to understand it. You don't simply dismiss it from the outset because it has no explanation.
Right. So basically, Hofstadter says something. He goes a little further, and it's somewhere in between. I mean, we were both fishing around in the same paragraphs there, and he says, well, I would not want to publish that paper if I were the editor, because it's just obvious that there's something wrong about it. So you would have to, instead of publishing the paper, you'd do the research to figure out what was wrong, and then maybe you'd publish something. But it's this, it definitely, and he's very clear about it, it's interesting, he's definitely saying, no, I'm just not going to accept that. And it really does remind me of Feyerabend's discussion in his book on Against Method, where he's talking about Galileo and the church. But it's interesting that Feyerabend really says, well, the church had its point because it just didn't make any sense to them. Galileo said, just look through the telescope and you'll see for yourselves. And they said, no, I'm not going to look through this stupid telescope. I mean, obviously, if it's showing me something that I know isn't true, there's something wrong with the telescope. And it was kind of like this, except the other way around, right? So it's a debate that's been going on for centuries, I suppose.
I agree.
Okay. Okay, well, let me bring up another example. So we publish here at Mangalam, we publish a magazine called Gesar Magazine. It's named for a great cultural hero of Tibet. You're all welcome to subscribe. Just talk to me afterwards. And in the last issue, we published a translation from the Tibetan of some research that had been done by a Tibetan Lama who is interested in these kinds of questions, Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro. And he was reporting on an event that took place, I think, about 20 years ago, that is an event that's talked about a lot in the Tibetan tradition, but this was something quite modern. It's when certain lamas die, gradually their bodies, and this is well documented in hospitals and so on. I mean, when people come for treatment, their bodies maintain certain. They don't die quite the way other people do. They stay in a meditation posture, for instance, and their bodies stay warm. These kinds of things. That's been documented, although I don't know how many people would accept that. But in any case, sometimes, very rare, the body will actually disappear. It will shrink and shrink and shrink until it disappears. There's a phenomenon called tukten. And this was a case where the body disappeared. And the Lama who was investigating it, really all he could do, he wasn't there, all he could do was interview the witnesses who were students of the Lama. And one of the interesting things about the interview was that, or about their account, was that it made them very nervous. And especially it made them nervous because usually when this phenomenon happens, if you can say usually in that kind of phenomenon, the fingernails are left and the hair because they're not organic. But in this case, there was nothing, just disappeared completely. And so they were afraid. They said, nobody's going to believe us because there's no evidence. But they still reported this. And so he interviewed them, and he concludes, he said, these seem to be very credible witnesses, and that's about all I can say, and this is their account, right? So you get something like that. The reason I'm bringing it up is you get something like that where here's some people giving you an account, and it seems like there's two possibilities. One is something like this happened. Maybe they didn't get all the details right, but something like this happened. And the other is they lied, right? Or maybe, if you were trying to be very generous, they just sort of deluded themselves into thinking this. But basically, it comes down to they lied. And I think scientists in general, when you get like these rebirth cases, sometimes they'll say, well, this and that, and they'll come up with various explanations, right? But ultimately, in the end, maybe they just say, well, we don't believe, we can't afford to believe these people. Maybe that's the issue. It kind of comes back to the Hofstadter quote, right? We can't afford to accept that this is possible because it's so antithetical to everything on which we've based our scientific careers. And that seems to be the case because there's so much hostility to this kind of research. As you say somewhere in the book, it tends to destroy people's careers if they go off in this direction.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting. It's just an interesting question in human psychology and social, psychology around why there is so much resistance. And I mean, my kind of naive spin on that, and it's not just me. There's actually a social psychologist at Duke by the name of Mark Leary, who wrote a beautiful little, I refer to it in the book, a beautiful little 3-page thing about 5 years ago or something like that. It was called, "Why Are Some Psychologists So Afraid of the Paranormal?" And it wasn't, he had no interest in that field, but he was very interested in the magnitude of the emotional reaction to folks who were taking it seriously as an endeavor of investigation. And his conclusion, and I tend to agree with this, is that ultimately it's very threatening to us to believe that we may know so little about what actually is going on. That reality is just way more weird, and whatever our interaction with it is just way more weird and interesting and complex than anything that we've been able to capture so far. And that seems to be very disturbing to folks. With respect to the specific issue of the Tukdam, it's a very interesting phenomena that is widely reported and would benefit from increasing scientific investigation, which is happening right now. There actually are, at this very moment, there's a team of researchers in India that has been working there for a number of years, together with a filmmaker, and they're actually trying to document these things. Now, it's very likely that some of these phenomena, I don't know about the completely, yes, it is part of the lore where bodies completely disappear, but that's much less common than just bodies shrinking and staying non-decomposing in a state of, this is even in high heat, high humidity conditions in India, where after weeks, the body is still not decaying. And it's shrinking a little bit. And so that's all very weird and very documentable. And they're trying to do this right now. But it also may be a subtle phenomena. So if you can imagine, like here's a llama that's died, and they often choose to die. They will tell their students, I'm an old guy, my body's wearing out. I'm ready to go. So come. I'm going to deliver some teachings for a few weeks, and then I'll see you. And then he'll just go sit in the corner somewhere and die. And then his body stays in that state for weeks. But it could be that if you go in there with probes and EEGs and messing with it in various ways, that might disturb in some way the subtlety of whatever's going on there, and it may not be so capturable. This is not like setting up an experiment in a laboratory and then being able to replicate it over and over again.
There's an interesting example in one of the chapters about near-death experiences and the out-of-body experiences that often accompany them, about a woman. It's a very convincing example of a woman who almost died and came back out of an operation, and she said she'd had an out-of-body experience, and she was very excited about it. And she said, I was up above the hospital, and I was able to move around, and over on one side of the hospital, I saw this tennis shoe. And it was blue, and the lace was tucked under the heel, and it was scuffed in the front. And one of the nurses, I think, who had been involved was thought that was sufficiently interesting that she went and looked for it. And in fact, she found exactly what the woman had described. So that's a pretty interesting example, right? So what interested me in part about that was then they thought, well, maybe we could try to control for, or we could try to do a study, because it was all after the fact, right? You can't really do like a laboratory experiment. And so apparently there were some operating rooms in one of these hospitals where they put things up at the top of the room, little artifacts, just in case somebody happened to have an out-of-body experience like that, and then they could describe what they saw. But in fact, they never came across it. It's like, looking for neutrinos, and you set up these measuring devices, but the event is so rare that you're not going to get anything, right? And I guess the Tukdam thing sounds sort of like that, right? You can't. I mean, if you somehow got word, oh, this person plans on dying, and who knows, maybe he'll do a rainbow body kind of thing, then you could film it. And there is one of these monks in Mongolia, actually, who is like that. His body hasn't decayed, and they take it out every 5 years and parade it around. But that's just not going to be convincing to somebody who's not already interested, right?
Yeah, and there may not be anything paranormal going on in those shrinking bodies and so forth. There have been various arguments that it has to do with the purity of their body, that they didn't decay, and that and then it just desiccates without decay and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, that's not the same as disappearing. That would be weird.
Right.
But the idea of trying to study these things in the way that we're used to setting up controlled experiments in contemporary science may not work so well in a lot of the cases, as the near-death out-of-body experience study in the hospital, which looked at over 1,000 patients. It's been published in the journal Resuscitation a couple of years ago. It had multiple authors on it. It was done across a number of hospitals, and they just, hasn't panned out yet, but maybe it will at some point.
Yeah. So you say you have a footnote in the book where you say, I'm quoting now, you say, while many of these phenomena defy explanation in current scientific terms, they are not incapable of being studied by the methods of science. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, by the methods of science, I don't necessarily mean setting them up in the lab. I mean making as accurate and reliable observations as one can, documenting and checking out in whatever ways are possible any things that come by way of story, just getting multiple informants to report on reports where that's possible, things like this, by tackling it as a rigorous, empirically investigatable phenomena. That's what I mean by the methods. So it's a broad definition.
Okay. There's Imre Lakatos, who's a philosopher of science, says somewhere, science is just the word we use for the most favored kind of knowledge we have in our society. And if you take that approach, that opens things up quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So one of the things about science, the way we do it now, is it's totally, I think, it's totally based in materialism, right? Materialism is baked in. And that's one of the reasons that people say, well, I could never accept this kind of phenomenon because there's no way to account for it in terms of the interactions of matter. And you have a quote by William James in the book where he says, it's not going to be a physics, it's going to have to be a metaphysics. And I think he's using metaphysics in the original sense of the word, which means something that comes after physics or beyond physics or in addition to physics, something like that. And I guess my question is there a... Do you see a possibility for doing a science that is metaphysical in that sense?
Absolutely. Let me make a few comments on that. First of all, many of you may know of William James, who was he was actually the first professor of psychology in the United States. He was at Harvard in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it's really one of the founders of modern empirical psychology. And a lot of what I say in this book is no different than what he was saying 125 years ago. And that's why I quote so liberally from him, because he had a whole vision of expanding a science of mind into new territory that included a huge focus on the kinds of phenomena that I discuss in there, which were already, in various manifestations known in his day, and he spent a lot of time in looking into these things, and that aspect. I mean, the psychology building at Harvard is named after him. He's revered in American psychology, and yet no one wants to own this huge part of his career, which was, in fact, probably the most important thing to him as a way forward. And then it all got completely steamrolled by the juggernaut of behaviorism in the early 20th century, where out of physics envy, I think, the psychologists wanted to become a real science like physics. And in order to do that, we have to do only laboratory experiments where we can do good statistics and replicate it over and over again and so forth, and forget all of this stuff about weird phenomena that you have to make observations of and can't replicate and so forth. So there's that. So the idea of, by metaphysics, is meant the framework within which we interpret the results of our scientific investigations. So for contemporary science, that metaphysics could be called physical materialism, or simply materialism sometimes. And that's the notion that all of reality is ultimately material. It's matter. It's matter and its energetic interactions. And that whatever mind is, whatever consciousness is, whatever mental phenomena there are, that all has to be secondary and emergent from the material world in some way. So that's why in contemporary psychology and neuroscience, the only way we have of investigating or understanding mind is by investigating the material correlates of it, which are brain activity. So the idea that by studying the brain more and more and the body more and more, we'll eventually figure it out well enough that we'll understand how consciousness emerges out of that in some way. So our metaphysics is material. And in contrast, you can have a metaphysics of, like, the guy after whom our very city is named, Bishop George Berkeley, who was the opposite of that. He was an idealist or a mentalist. He believed that everything was mental and that nothing existed except through perception of it, and there was no meaning to talking about a material world other than that. Nobody knows that about the guy after whom Berkeley was named. That's not why Berkeley was named after him, because he was an idealist. It was named after him because he also wrote a poem about the future of humanity as lying to the West, and he was Irish. So the West was America, and the furthest west was California. He wasn't thinking about California. He'd never been here, but the guys who started the University of California knew that poem, and they said, let's call this place Berkeley, after him. So there are other kinds of metaphysics, and then there's a metaphysics which is called panpsychism, which describes whatever the mentality is as permeating all of the world, all of reality. It's there. There's a psychic component to an atom, as well as to a human, and so forth. So I don't have a problem with the metaphysics of materialism in a way. But I feel like we are wont to define materialism too narrowly. Like, for example, you could explain everything that's in that book and almost any kind of weird paranormal phenomena simply by imagining that there's another dimension that's as material as this one, another dimension of space-time plus one reality, of which we have no direct access. And so many of you are probably familiar with the little novella Flatland from the 1880s. You know, this little book about this world which took place on a two-dimensional surface. And if anything came in from the third dimension to this two-dimensional surface, the creatures who lived there would be like completely bamboozled. You know, what's going on with that? And then it disappears. I mean, that's a ghost, right? I mean, it comes and then it goes. So if there's actually another dimension that we don't have access to under normal circumstances, then things could be flitting in and out of that dimension in all kinds of weird ways. And that might account for a lot of weird phenomena. That's still essentially material in some way. You could capture that by a larger physics that integrated in that dimension, maybe found the right equation to describe it and so forth. So maybe that will be the physics of the future in 100 years. We'll know the mathematics for that. Maybe not, but it could be. So I don't rule out a further kind of physical materialist way forward. And at the same time, I think we have to honor the data that we have and not dismiss it because it's not understandable in our current system. Now, when James used that quote, he was basically saying that this revolution is so big, this revolution that will transform. It's a really beautiful quote because he says, and this is in 1895 or something like that, he's saying that psychology today is in the same situation that physics was before Galileo, or chemistry was before Lavoisier. And that whoever will be the equivalent of the folks that really moved the disciplines of physics and chemistry forward in the mind sciences, they're not here yet. So, you know, when they come to move things forward in some way, it will be an even bigger revolutionary reconfiguration of how we understand things, which will necessarily impact even our metaphysics of like the important role of mind and reality in some way.
Okay, great. I'm just going to add one thing since we're in this field, and then I'll throw it open for questions. And that is that there's another story that's told about James, which is that he once attended a lecture that was given by a Buddhist monk who was talking about Buddhist Abhidharma, which is in large part has to do with the study of the mind. And that when that lecture was over, James stood up and he said, "This is the psychology of the future." So we're still waiting for that connection to be made, I guess, but one of the reasons we're here tonight. Okay, well, thank you so much, David. Let's just go ahead and throw it up open for questions. So is there somebody around who's going to do the microphone business? So we have one here, one there, one there. We'll start with those three. Right here. Well, okay, those three, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, some. Is this working?
No.
I'm not sure this is working. I can still talk.
Is there an on switch?
Okay. Some modern physicists, quantum physicists, have the conception that consciousness is the ultimate basis of reality. And that explains all the paranormal phenomena, including the studies by Beryl Bem, in which he shows that the future can affect the present, or it's called retrocausation, I think. Mm-hmm. And also visions by mystics are also confirmed by this new physics. I would like to know if you if this kind of information, this kind of science is being also discussed with the Buddhist monks. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Are you a quantum physicist? So yeah. In fact, the Dalai Lama, I think if he had to pick one thing as his most number one interest in discussing with scientists, it would be quantum physics. He's really interested in the quantum physics perspective on reality. And I completely agree with that. I think that quantum physics, I don't think it has an explanation for these things in a way that's agreed upon. But it has clues in it that suggest, in my opinion, quantum physics is the one physical theory we have that suggests that there are weird entanglements or enfoldings of mind and reality that we don't know how to capture. And where that comes up in quantum mechanics, I have to say I started out, my undergraduate degree is in physics, and I started out in graduate school at Caltech in theoretical physics. So I studied that at that time, and then I switched into biology because I was advised by one of the faculty there that if I wanted to continue the study of this, I should probably learn some biology because they didn't know diddly squat. So that was that. But I'm very interested in physics still. And at the kind of frontiers of what are called the foundations of physics, there's a disagreement among physicists who spend their entire careers studying these things about how to interpret the results of the measurements as needing to have the presence or absence of a sort of consciousness or mind kind of component of that. So there are many physicists who believe that it is necessary, and that, in fact, if you adopt that stance, that quantum physics, perhaps even as we know it now, still has the capacity to kind of explain some of those things, but it doesn't really. You can't make empirical predictions. You can just show that it's not inconsistent. And so when people say the laws of physics don't allow us to have backward in time effects, that's not true. According to many physicists. I think that whatever the next big theory is in physics, it will involve some kind of extending that, some kind of extension of these kind of interpretation mysteries in quantum physics right now into new and more encompassing domains. So absolutely, I think that's a valuable direction.
Okay, up here, do we have someone who could hand the microphone around? Thank you for helping.
Thank you, sir. This is a great talk, inspiring. My question is, have you thought of, or have you worked with paranormal activity as such as telekinesis? And if so, the methods to investigate that in an academic setting, would that be similar to what you have been doing with other past life and other?
Okay, well, telekinesis. Well, first of all, I have to say that I personally have not done any of these experiments. In the book, the chapters that are written about the paranormal things are by 4 people who are each world experts in those domains of near-death experience, of small children talking spontaneously about other lives, of apparitions associated with death, and then laboratory studies of paranormal phenomena. So he would be the one that could could speak to that. But yes, I mean, so some kind of psychokinesis kind of thing where you have a presumed effect of thinking on a material thing which is separate from the body is something that folks attempt to study in laboratories, and people have claimed to find various things, but nobody has really investigated these things deeply enough to try to get at what's going on. I mean, the closest example of something like that, well, first of all, I should say that when it comes to how mind affects anything, it's a bit of a mystery, right? It's, I decide to move my arm up and down. Well, where does the actual original intention to move my arm up and down come from? It comes from some kind of pattern of brain activity, presumably, but was there ever at any point any need for something outside of brain activity to happen? Some kind of thought, which is more than just the activity of the brain. We don't know how to resolve that. So even within our own body, what the connection is between mind and movement is not understood. Do we really have will, or are we just machines? We don't know, really. So if you look at something like psychokinesis, you're just moving that outside the body. So there's something over there, and by merely thinking, I'm moving it in some way. To me, that's really no more mysterious than even something going on within our own body. We just need another physical field of some kind to explain that, in a way, if it's happening. But first of all, we have to establish it's happening. People are studying it, but I don't know what the latest is.
Okay. So you were next, yes? Yes.
Hi. Thank you. So, would you think that the capacity for consciousness, as we think of it, is predicated on the ability to think in words, to have the capacity for linguistics?
I don't know what the capacity for having consciousness is predicated on. No one does, really. I can tell you that when it comes to human consciousness, there are at least two schools of thought around the role of language. Those that feel that it's actually a necessary prerequisite for conscious awareness. And so by conscious awareness, I simply mean having the experience of what it's like to be you. You have that experience of what it's like to be you. If you also happen to have language, does that mean, that certainly enriches and elaborates upon that experience. The question is it necessary to have the language there? Nobody knows the answer to that. The closest we can get is to study, for example, very young babies, babies that don't yet have linguistic capacity. If you believe that needing to have language, develop language in order to have conscious awareness, then you would say that a newborn baby isn't conscious. They don't have a picture of the world because of that. Or certainly your dog or your cat isn't conscious, and so forth. So the answer to that is not known. I don't have an opinion on it. Well, I guess I do, because I believe that whatever awareness is, it probably transcends language. That it goes that not only would nonverbal humans have it, but lots of creatures have some kind of awareness. Then the question is, how far does that extend? I like to tease the Buddhists that I work with in India this way. It's like, you just swatted a mosquito. Do you think that mosquito was conscious? And then they go, oops, maybe it is. And then, what about a worm? No, worm's not conscious. Why not? Well, it doesn't have any eyes. Well, it kind of does. So there's no answers to these things. And, I don't think personally that language is necessary, but there are people, on the faculty at UC Berkeley that do. So, I could spend all night arguing with them, but I wouldn't have any.
Okay, so we have time for just a couple more questions. Okay, so I see three. Okay, I see four hands. Why don't you go next? We'll wait for the mic. And then there were two over here and one there. That's it.
Well, I don't have a question. I have a consciousness lowering comment. My first trip to Asia was in 1957, and I was full of very typical Western arrogance. I just assumed that anything that didn't comply with our beliefs and our knowledge must be superstition. And so, if it was a long trip, a 7-month trip, and many times I kind of mumbled to myself, Asian superstition. But then a number of things happened. And one of them was in Sri Lanka, when my husband and I, came across a very well-educated Theravada monk, very fluent in English too. And he told us about a young boy who had been talking about his previous lifetime as a monk. And that's familiar with the kind of stories you've told. But he said the boy was speaking in Pali. I mean, as a young child, he began speaking in Pali. Pali is not a spoken language anymore. Scholars learn it. It's the language of Theravada Buddhism, but it's not spoken. Anyway, that's the story.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that. There are stories, yes.
I have just a couple of comments that I'd like you to comment on. One is that a few years ago I attended a lecture by Lee Smolin, the physicist. And one of the things he said, which kind of surprised me, was that, and he was kind of lamenting this, that he said that physics can account for a lot, but what it does not account for, one of the things it does not account for, is the actual structure of our experience, where something new comes up, it goes away, and something else replaces it. I got the sense that he would kind of was lamenting this. The second thing is that my understanding is that James was neither a mentalist nor a physicalist. He wanted to expand the category of beyond these traditional categories, and his broadest category was experience. So if you could comment.
Yeah, well, it's true that James was, he didn't want to get stuck. One of the problems with categories like materialism or physical materialism or mentalism is they create these boxes that are way more simple way more simple than what reality likely is. And so they can really constrain our capacity to kind of think in an expansive, out-of-the-box kind of way. And James recognized that everything that we are aware of comes through our experience. And so for him, experience was the ultimate ground of reality. And then he adopted another phrase of James that I really like is radical empiricism. You know, the idea that for science to move forward, it needs to be empirical. It needs to take seriously how the world shows up to us and what the data of experience are, and be radical about that. Don't throw things out simply because they don't fit with our model of how things ought to be. With respect to the comment of the physicists and so forth, the idea that somehow our experience or our mentality is tied up with what reality is can be disturbing to physicists. It creeped Einstein out. That's what Einstein's big beef was around. I mean, he saw that quantum physics was presenting a set of issues that made this kind of capacity to think of the universe as existing out there objectively independent of our observation of it no longer tenable. And that really disturbed him as a scientist. He had grown up in a tradition and believed in this tradition of being able to describe things in an objective way. And as we were talking earlier, quantum physics hints that that's not going to be so easy anymore. And Einstein saw that in his brilliance. He saw that from the very beginning, from 1905 on, when he put it out there around light quanta and the photoelectric effect. He already had the intuition that this is going to be a deep problem for this notion of objective reality, and he continued to point that out for the rest of his life. And his last paper in quantum physics in 1935, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper, which introduced the idea of entanglement, which was a word that Schrödinger applied to it a couple of years later, was sort of his final illustration of this is just too weird, So, but that's what reality is. It seems to be very weird, and we haven't even we haven't seen half of it yet.
So we've got two final questions, and I'm sorry I can't take any more. We're already over time. So there was one here, and there was somebody over there. Okay, why don't you start, and then we'll end up with you.
Hello, Mr. Presti. Thank you for coming to talk. My question was, so it seems we're at this barrier of how to convey and share the supernatural or paranormal knowledge that doesn't really fit into our scope. So what do you think what has been most successful for you in making studies believable and digestible that aren't necessarily traditional? And what is something untraditional that you think the public should have more knowledge of?
Well, first of all, I have no track record in talking about this stuff. I mean, this book is a complete coming out. I mean, and you know, in a big way about like paranormal on the cover and everything. That I you know, as some have said, I may never work in this town again. So I don't know how it's going to be, you know, received, and whether this. I mean, the method that I've used in this book has been to try to frame this in the context of the history and philosophy of science in a really straightforward, tiny step by tiny step way, so that one can at least be open to this data as an empirical scientist. That's the way I've framed it. I'm not claiming that any of this stuff would be replicable if 1,000 rigorous scientists were actually working on it instead of 5. You know, so I mean, we need to get a critical mass of interest in the subject. My suspicion is that it will be, you know, that these phenomena will continue to hold up, but that remains to be seen. So this is my way of trying to open up the conversation and get the word out. And you know, I hope it has a positive benefit and just doesn't, you know, lead nowhere and to getting me fired too. So that's one thing. In terms of something that, I mean, I guess I would just say be open to the weird. You know, be open to the weird in one's own life, because as people like Jung, you know, has said decades ago, when you move through life with an openness that things are going on that you don't understand or you can't explain, then you kind of notice more and more of it. And we're conditioned and brainwashed by our system to ignore that stuff and just to dismiss it. And to the extent that we pay more attention to it, one may become more and more aware of it in our own lives. And then to use that, again, my agenda here is not to pursue this simply because it's a interesting scientific question, which I believe it is, but I believe that by a rigorous investigation of these anomalous, inexplicable things, that what we will discover is that there's more and more deeper interconnectivities between mind and world than we're able to capture right now. The big lesson of modern biology really has been that all of life is way more deeply interconnected than we ever imagined. You know, with our own human microbiome, all these billions of organisms that are living symbiotically with us and contributing massively to our state of health and disease. Just as we see that there's a vast interconnectivity in the biosphere, all of this at a very kind of tangible physical level, I believe that these kinds of investigations will reveal more and more interconnections between mind and world, so that what we actually think really does have an impact on the world around us in some way that we can't capture yet with our physics. And I think that will be a good thing for humanity. That's my belief. So.
Okay, final question.
I had a question about hallucinogenics, but that was such a nice ending. I'm going to ask something a little more emotional. Do you believe in God?
What's God?
a good question. Thanks very much.
Well, let me say this. I believe in a deep interconnectivity in all of reality and a deep mystery in that interconnectivity as far as our current awareness of it. So I think for some that might be similar to kind of some conceptions of God. But that we are not separate from one another. We're not separate from the world around us, from other life forms, from the biosphere, from our geology. You know, that literally there's a kind of all oneness to the universe that we're not. I mean, we only catch glimpses of now and again, but we can continue to move forward in deeper appreciation of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for staying here. And it's been great. So there are refreshments downstairs. We invite you to come down and join us for conversation as well.